Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the latest lesser known but awesome heroes. And today I'll be talking about the character that you see at the end of my lesser known intro. Yes, I'll be talking about Vic Sage and Renee Montoya, the two people that have taken up the mantle of the detective known as the Question. And we will start first with Vic Sage. However, that is his newscaster name. His real name is Charles Victor Szaszz, S-Z-A-S-Z. And he was created by Steve Ditko. And he first appeared in Blue Beetle #1 of June of 1967. And he was originally created for Charleston Comics, but would then be acquired by DC Comics in the early 80s and would be incorporated into the DCU. And he was conceived by Ditko as a person who used objectivism during his career as a minor hero. However, much like Mr. A, another Ditko character, in his solo run from 1987 to 1990, he would develop a Zen-like philosophy. Based in Hub City, Vic Sage made his mark as a highly outspoken and aggressive investigative journalist. Not long after starting his TV appearances, he began to investigate Dr. R.B. Twain. Sage was approached by Alistair Rodar, his former professor, currently a scientist, who told Sage about an artificial skin he had co-developed with Twain called Fezzudrum. I'll just call it like that. It was intended to work as an applied skin-like bandage with the help of a bonding gas, but it had an unforeseen toxicity which was sometimes fatal when applied to open wounds. They agreed to abandon the project and parted ways. However, Rodar discovered that Twain had decided to proceed with an illegal sale of the invention to third world nations, regardless of the risk to human health. Sage resolved to stop him, but had no way of going after Twain without exposing himself. Rodar suggested that Sage use a mask made out of the same material to cover his famous features. Armed with information and, more importantly, a disguise, he caught up with Twain, stopping the transaction and extracting a confession, leaving him bound in the chemical. On TV, Sage reported his illegal activities. He decided that this new identity would be useful for future investigations. And teaming up with Rodar, he eventually modified the bonding gas to change the color of his hair and clothing. The two men became very close friends, and he would affectionately refer to Rodar as Tot. Compared to other superhero characters in the Silver Age, the Question was more ruthless in his methods. For example, when he was fighting some criminals in a sewer and knocked them into a deep and fast-moving water flow, he declined to pull them out despite the real danger of drowning. Instead, he left to notify the police to retrieve them in case they survived the ordeal. When Charleston Comics was acquired by DC, the Question was briefly in the Crisis on Infinite Earths and in a 2-issue arc of the Blue Beetle revival. And it was then that in 1987 that Denny O'Neil, yes, the guy who made Batman Nightfall, would eventually take over the writing for the Question series. And it was published in a 36 issue 2-annual 5-quarterly special series. In Question #1, he was defeated in personal combat first by Lady Shiva, beaten nearly to death by her thugs, shot in the head with a pellet gun, and then thrown in a river to drown. Lady Shiva then rescued him for reasons of her own and gave him directions to meet Richard Dragon, who would eventually later train him in martial arts and Eastern philosophy. When he returned to the city, he resumed his journalist and superhero careers with adventures tended to illustrate various philosophical points. To further these ideals, Denny O'Neil had a reading recommendation in letters of each issue. In his series, he was an investigative reporter for the news station KBELR in Hub City. And pretty much all he was really, and pretty much Denny O'Neil was doing what Denny O'Neil did. He talked about politics and society and all those kinds of trends, and he basically used that for the question. And for the majority of the series, he would have him yeah, pretty much. And pretty much, actually, here we go. Yeah, I had to sift through a couple of things, guys. But basically, Denny O'Neil would basically make the question a character that would be more of a vigilante that the police would come into conflict with. However, it was during the question annual number 2 that they would retcon his origin, that he was an orphan with a reputation as a troublemaker. And he prided himself on defiantly enduring the physical abuse of the Catholic orphanage. He would eventually manage to get into college where he studied journalism. However, his higher learning did not mellow his violent tendencies. As such, when he beat up his pusher for giving him LSD, which caused the frightening experience of doubting his own senses under its influence. And apparently in 2005, if I'm reading this correctly, he would eventually be replaced as like a guy who would basically hallucinate while using the gas and whatnot and what have you. He's had an interest in Huntress. He's been part of the 52. And eventually he would train Renee Montoya to be his replacement, and he would be reanimated as a Black Lantern. And it's just, yeah, there's tons of references, and the question surprisingly has actually been used in quite a bit of media. And, you know, he's been in Justice League Unlimited, all these kinds of cartoons. He's been in Brave and the Bold. I mean, Vic Sage was, even Alan Moore, when he did Watchmen, Rorschach was supposedly a spinoff of The Question. So yeah, sorry guys that I couldn't quite get very much for Vic Sage, but there was just a whole bunch of, like, you know, ho-hum kind of details that I'm sure most of you really wouldn't want to hear about. You know, political satire and stuff that Denny O'Neil kind of, you know, does, because it's Denny O'Neil. But anyway, we move on to his successor, Renee Montoya, who was initially created for Batman the Animated Series and was promptly introduced into the mainstream comics before the airing of her animated debut in 1992. The character was developed significantly over the years. She was initially a police detective for the GCPD, assigned to the Major Crimes Unit, and would come into contact with Batman. However, over the course of her comic book history, she would be outed as a lesbian and would later resign from the police force, disgusted by its corruption. And she would eventually be inspired by Vic Sage and would actually train with Richard Dragon alongside him to become the new Question before Sage had passed away. And she now works out of a lighthouse alongside, you know, Rodar or Tot, you know, in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And okay, she was eventually a uniformed officer partnered with Harvey Bullock in the animated series. In a follow-up to the new Batman adventures, she had been promoted from police officer to detective. She was also a recurring character in the 3rd season of the web cartoon Gotham Girls. The show's official Bible describes her as the widow of a fellow police officer who was killed in the line of duty, as well as an active volunteer at her Roman Catholic Church. But this information was never mentioned on the series itself. The comic series Gotham Central describes her as the daughter of immigrants from the Dominican Republic. She is also a recurring character. She became a recurring character in the Batman-related comics after Batman number 475. After she had been promoted to homicide detective by Gordon, she would again be partnered with Harvey Bullock, who after Bullock is promoted to lieutenant, Crispus Allen became her new partner, and so on and so forth. And during the Cataclysm crossover, and No Man's Land and what have you, she was one of only two that stayed behind with Gordon in order to keep, the peace among the people. She is the focus of an uneasy truce between Gordon's forces and Two-Face. She reaches out to Two-Face's Harvey Dent persona in helping in relief efforts, and he falls in love with her. He in fact keeps her restrained in his headquarters against her will. She becomes involved when Two-Face puts James Gordon on trial for perceived wrongdoing. She persuades Two-Face to offer a more fair trial, giving Gordon a defense lawyer. Two-Face's Harvey Dent persona takes on this role and ultimately convinces Two-Face to allow everyone to go free. Gotham City is later reopened. Blah blah blah. They find out that she's a lesbian and she has to resign because of all the hate stuff. She would eventually meet Vic Sage, who is dying of cancer. She's inspired by him after a long while of just battling bouts of alcoholism and anger management and all this kind of stuff. And when Sage had contracted cancer, he was going to die out. And being inspired by him, she's like, look, I can't be a police officer anymore, and I'm inspired by you. It's like, can you help me? So he takes her to Richard Dragon, who helps train her in martial arts. And also she meets with Tot, who gives her basically the face mask and whatnot and what have you, and she becomes the new Question. And she would also become partially a reserve member for the Birds of Prey, and she would also eventually, currently in the comics, proceed a lesbian-like relationship with Catherine Kane, or Kathy Kane, however you want to pronounce that. Yes, Batwoman. In many comics, including the Batwoman comics, she and Renee and Kane are in fact lovers. And yeah. And sorry guys, I didn't mean to pause here, but I'm just trying to figure out, I'm just reading this information. Here we go. Aha. And here we go. Sorry guys, I didn't mean to just nod off here, but Okay, eventually during training with Richard Dragon, she eventually finds herself, and when she comes back as the new Question, Renee tracks down eventually tracks down Inner Gang, and she actually gets into a fist fight with Bruno Mannheim, to which she does barely survive until Batman arrives, but at least for a small bit she holds her own. Um, and eventually she would have her own Detective Comics. She would fight Vic Sage during Blackest Night. She would just eventually eventually, Renee Montoya just this and that, and I'm sorry guys, I can't really find much more like interesting information. It's just like I said, a lot of this is just ho-hum and hearsay and stuff. But anyway, guys, for what it's worth, that is the Question in a nutshell. Even though the Question is an extremely lesser-known detective character, what makes Renee Montoya and Vic Sage awesome? Well, that, no pun intended, is the question.